Good morning or good evening, depending on where this is located. We've got people distributed from England to the West Coast, United States. So morning where I am. Welcome to the Conflict Consortium Virtual Workshop. We're delighted to have Margherita Belgioioso here with her paper, No Place Like Home, Terrorism and Rebel Groups, Population Dependency in Civil War. Christian Davenport can't be with us, and Joe Young has been gracious enough to step in as the chair. And Erin Kearns is going to get us started with a few comments. The floor is yours, Erin.
Thank you. So I'm Erin Kearns. I am finishing up my PhD right now at American University, and I'm currently in a role as a postdoctoral research fellow down at Georgia State, looking at experimental terrorism research, which is largely cross-national research, not actually experimenting with terrorism. I really enjoyed your paper, Margherita. Sort of starting off one general comment throughout. So just the framing of it, something that I noticed is that sort of the puzzle that you're addressing that's implied in the project is why do some rebel groups use terrorism more than others, I would assume. But it wasn't really explicitly stated and woven throughout some of the narrative. So it's some more attention perhaps to, telling a story on the front end and then talking about how the literature refers back to answering or explaining the story, or where it doesn't, and then how your case, how your the methodological approach also addresses that. I think would really help to bring the reader into it a little bit more and engage in why this is important, not just from an academic perspective, but also from the perspective of just someone who's perhaps not as invested in this world as we are, why they would be interested in this distinction. I noticed that there was one part where you made reference to a couple of different groups, the LRA and a few others, perhaps just spelling that out a little bit more, where we see these distinctions in the real world, where there might be differences, not just perhaps between groups, but also how a particular group changes in their tactics over time. I think it would be just an interesting way to bring the story to life a little bit more. It also might help with paring down a bit of the front end, which was, in some places it felt thorough, certainly, but perhaps some of that could have been synthesized a bit more or cut down just to stay sort of on message and telling that story from the beginning. One of the comments or questions sort of I had with the analyses, and this is building on some of the work that it's something that I've done in my own work, so it's perhaps particularly salient to me. But how do you handle the large number of terrorist attacks where we don't know who the perpetrator is? So, in the GTD, the vast majority of attacks aren't claimed. Some of them that are attributed to a particular group with varying levels of certainty. But I'm just curious of how you address that both in the number of attacks, the number of fatalities by the terrorist organizations, and if that's something that you've considered, as well as what sort of how you handle situations where there might be multiple groups and it's not certain, whether one group was truly the perpetrator versus the other. There's some literature on this as well, I believe, looking at how just the fact that if there is more sort of armed conflict, that can reduce the number of reported terrorist attacks, because it really that it's reducing violence, or just that the same violence is then getting categorized as something else. So just how you sort of have addressed that and tackled that. That was sort of the bulk of my comments on the theory and the method side of things. Just also in the conclusion, again, sort of goes back to my first comment about having more of a puzzle and a story throughout, bringing that then into the conclusion to wrap up sort of what we've learned and why it matters, both theoretically, but also from more of a policy or public interest perspective. Sorry, I just threw a lot at you.
Not at all. That's your job. Appreciate it, Erin. Let's turn it over to Margherita, and then Joe, you'll jump in and do the tossing back and forth, okay?
Okay, so thanks for these comments, and thanks for being here, and thanks for reading the paper. So I think I need to tell you that this is a very, very first draft, and so any comment on the structure, on how to frame it, and even on the analysis, and like for extra robustness check and stuff like that, are very welcome. Thanks, Erin. So I'll certainly take into account and like try to move towards what you suggested with regard to the framing, and also try to expand on the examples and maybe like explain, maybe take one and like use it as almost a case and trace over time the differences in tactics. And then regarding the analysis, so what happened with the GTD attacks that doesn't have a perpetrator? They drop. So I do not have those terrorist attacks accounted for. Maybe it makes sense to check how many of them are there, and maybe see whether there is some sort of regularity in like where there are more terrorist attacks that do not have a perpetrator located in. Concerning the multiple groups, and so what I had to actually deal with is that the fact that in GTD, sort of a group might take different names, and so the way I go for it is basically taking the main name according to Tor crosswalk and just use that. I'm done. But thank you again.
Okay, would someone else like to jump in? Yeah, Victor and then David.
First, I need to unmute myself. I believe I'm supposed to introduce myself also. My name is Victor Asal. I'm an associate professor at University of Albany, and I study why people blow each other up and why people discriminate against each other, and I do so quantitatively and experimentally and pedagogically. So I have a whole bunch of comments, Margherita, but I'm going to focus on a couple, and then I'll come back to some others. And I should note that whenever I read a paper, I read it to say, what do we need to do to get this paper published? Okay, and I think your paper is really interesting, and I think that it's something that could be published with the right framing. The first thing I would do is go through the paper and spell check it vigorously. Okay, for a bunch of different errors, and offline we can talk about that. More substantively, well, actually, one other issue that I would say, I'm a big fan of old-fashioned probability tables, which lay out the probabilities all told together in one place so that I can see what the probability impact of each variable is. And I know there are other people who aren't fans of that, but it certainly helps me see everything in one place. So I would consider putting one of those in. That doesn't mean you have to take those other figures out, but I think it would be helpful to just have a probability table that lays that out in a clear fashion. I'm going to make one theoretical comment, and then I'll come back as we go around. I think that a better discussion and a clear discussion of finances and military impact of this external aid coming out, I think that's key. I think delving into the literature, so for example, really getting into the literature of resources, because one could make a counter argument that any insurgency organization that's getting a lot of resources, whether military or financial, doesn't necessarily need to depend upon the local populace, right? I mean, you couldn't. So really digging into those arguments that already exist and teasing that out, I think, is key. And trying to figure out what is really driving this, because you could, if the results were flipped or different, you could make an easy argument at the level that you're making it. I would dig deeper into that argument. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to pause now, and I'm happy to get back into the queue.
David?
Do you want to answer? No.
Oh no, go ahead.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, just briefly. So, so I would be very happy to talk to you about how to frame this in more effective way? And do you think the probability table can be in the appendix? And then if you could send me the literature on what is actually driving the support, the external support to local rebel groups, that would be great.
So can I two-finger myself,
Yeah,
Joe? Okay. So you mentioned, Margherita, you mentioned a lot of the key literature, but you don't really dig into the key literature. So for example, you mentioned Weinstein, but I would dig into Weinstein a lot deeper than where you are on Weinstein, okay? And relate it much more closely. So it's not that you don't have a connection to the literature, you do, but I need a much more explicit explanation and not just 3 or 4 sentences about why it should be this way or why it should be that way, because external resources, why are these different kinds of external resources having different impacts? And I think this is an interesting development and extension over some of the stuff that Weinstein and other people have done, but you need to dig into it deeper. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Will?
Okay, so I have a two-finger on this, but before I just say that, always put page numbers, because, you know, on page, and they aren't there, and I'm, anyway. So I think as it's currently drafted, as it's currently theorized, you're likely to draw some kinds of endogeneity critiques. And I think this builds off of what Victor, the way I heard what Victor was saying is, one of those is, well, why do some rebels end up getting external support and others don't, right? So offer some explanation of that. My major reaction theoretically was the exactly that, but the broad version for all 3 of yours. And it might help to think about it this way. The way it's currently theorized, you're implicitly assuming that each of those 3 factors is just assigned to the groups. It's effectively randomly assigned to the groups, you know. But I doubt you believe that it is. One of the problems that we all have in this literature, I mean, I've got all sorts of work on the dissent repression nexus, right? I never believed those 2 were exogenous, but I couldn't figure out how to endogenize the theory. Everybody focuses on the endogeneity as if it's a statistical thing. Well, yes, it is, but that's because the theory tells us those things are not independent, and we know that if we don't have independence in our independent variables, then that can be a problem. So, and like Victor, I don't think you're high and dry without literature and to leverage. So I encourage you to do that. I think on all 3. That I don't find that work easy, personally. Theorizing is not, I don't think of it as my strong suit, but I think there's some real opportunities to considerably strengthen what you have here, and so I wanted to jump on and echo Victor's point there.
Okay, I want to two-finger on this point just to talk a little bit about the framing. So I'm Joe Young, an associate professor at American University. I'm related to, I think, everyone in the room in some ways. So the issue about framing that Victor brought up is exactly right. Like, this is the point where at least my goal is to try and get you a publishable product. And I deviate a little bit from whatever other people say, is I think there is a better framing for it that you could use that maybe is a little bit more, not cutting edge, but just would be a way that would insert you in a conversation that's already existing and potentially resolve it. And so I'm thinking about, there's been arguments in the literature about the effectiveness of terrorism, like whether, I'm thinking about Max Abrams and Jacana Thomas, and there's other folks that have engaged in that debate that sort of does it as a tactic work. And I think you have an answer that resolves that in a way to say, well, it depends, because it's really not about whether you use it or not, it's about the proportion of using it. And so it's kind of a conceptual argument that could help relate those, and then you have some empirical evidence. So I almost think I would revolve the discussion around resolving that puzzle it's not really changing the focus of the paper as much as kind of changing the nature of the debate. So I don't know what you think or what other people think about that, and Will already has a strong reaction.
So, Margherita, would you like to say anything before I jump in, or?
I think they're all very interesting points, and the latter, I think I'll have to think a bit more about it, but it sounds like a very, very interesting suggestion.
So I want to say I think Joe's 100% right, except I think that would change the paper. So I think that, I mean, that which, by the way, is a really cool implication that did not dawn on me at all when I read it. So big ups to Joe for seeing that. I missed it completely. But yeah, I was sold listening to him. Wow, yeah, that, and sold that you have some implications, but B, that, and man, that's a big deal. That's a much bigger conversation to jump into. But you're currently not asking about effectiveness, right? So I think that would actually change the object of explanation, right? Right now you're trying to explain tactical choices, and I sent you some unpublished stuff of mine that is doing the exact same thing, trying to say, okay, if we want to think of this as tactics, right, this dissidence, and then you fired back the thing I hadn't known about, which is the nonviolent, right? So you and I are thinking in very much the same way in terms of some dissidents use nonviolence, some dissidents use violence where they target the state, and some dissidents use violence where they target, target non-state actors, populations, and try to use that leverage. And of course, some groups use all of them, et cetera. And so I think I would tend to think of that, what Joe's suggesting, as a very natural and probably much more impactful extension, but I don't know that I would do it in this. It would change the paper, and that, I think the other paper's the more important one. So I agree with Joe on that. Okay, yeah, I'm done, so jump in.
Can I just a little comment? So I can see how how the effective. So I think that this is not an ex post. I'm not trying to understand whether terrorism is successful, but so that's the thing. This is more about the effectiveness as perceived by the rebel group in the choice of the tactics. So I can see how these things are sort of very closely related. But yeah, probably maybe I can think about a second paper on the effect on the success of terrorism versus, or different balances between terrorism and conventional armed violence. Thank you.
Yeah, Victor, you want to jump in?
So this happened rarely, but I think Joe is wrong. Not in the sense that I don't think he's right that there's a very good paper to be done here, but I think I'm going to agree with you. I think it's a different paper. I think there are measures of effectiveness that you could pull in here, but I would still, and Joe, I want to get your feedback on this also, but I think focusing specifically on that, when you divide up how you're killing, I think that's really, really interesting, and that's what you're focusing on here. And I would continue for this paper to focus on that, and then take the insights you're getting about the issue of effectiveness from this paper to write a different paper on that. I mean, Joe, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and I mean, maybe I'm thinking at a conceptual level, because it's a little bit like sidestepping this whole is a tactic effective sort of question and saying, really, it's about a basket of choices and your group's general orientation in making these choices in the basket. And so that might be something that's tacked on in the conclusion about, here's some implications about the kind of general conceptual piece that then seeds the next project. David, are you ready to, or do we want to say anything else about the framing, or are we ready to shift gears a little.
And let David talk? Yes, I think that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me? All right, I'm David Cunningham at University of Maryland. And so I have a comment that might still be on framing, but is a little bit different than this. And again, I agree that there's a lot of interesting material here. And I'm also focused on trying to see what would turn this into a publishable paper. And for me, one of the things that I think is key is that I think the question about the portfolio of how much terrorism you do versus conventional warfare is an interesting one. But I'm not convinced that the story you're telling is actually exactly about that portfolio as much as it is about doing one or not, or doing the other or not. So I see some arguments about why you might use less terrorism or more terrorism, a bit less about why you might use more conventional warfare or less conventional warfare, but it's not clear to me that those are completely related choices, in that by using one more, you have to use the other less, or that there's sort of a set amount of actions that you're going to do and you're allocating them between terrorism and conventional warfare. And so I think the portfolio is really interesting, but I'm not conceptually convinced that the argument and the hypotheses are really as strong about that as they could be, or it's as clear that they are about that. And I think on that, I mean, one of the issues that comes up when you think about it as a portfolio is, of course, this conceptual question about to what degree are, you know, civil war and terrorism distinct, or can we actually separate out conventional tactics versus terrorism in a fully distinct manner? And that's a conceptual question that I think if you engage fully, if you go fully on the portfolio question, you really have to think about or really grapple with that distinction. And the one other point I would make, I have some others, but at this point sort of related to that is, it's not entirely clear from the paper why the rebel group is the appropriate unit, as opposed to, I mean, rebel groups aren't the only actor. Rebel groups that end up in the UCDP data aren't the only actors that make decisions about tactics. I mean, I think I know why you use rebel groups, right? Because that's where you can get the data. But I do think there needs to be some statement or some argument about why the rebel group is the appropriate unit, as opposed to, you know, violent organizations, or you could think about a variety of different units you could have with a similar focus to what you're doing here.
Will, did you want to two-finger on that?
It helps when I unmute, doesn't it? I wanted to give Margherita a chance to respond if she wanted to, or I can.
Yeah, so regarding the portfolio, I've been thinking about this. It's somehow kind of difficult to conceptualize, but really it's not a matter of one tactic going up and the other going down always. It's more like one can remain stable and the other can grow or go down, if it makes sense. And this would change the distribution of the proportion of the two tactics, right? That's why I'm talking about portfolio, but I surely need to think more about this, because it has not been the first time that this issue has been popped up. So, but yeah, the logic is simply that if one of the two goes up or down, if one of the two fluctuates, then the proportion will, the distribution of the proportion will change. And I'll think about a proper justification for why I'm looking at rebel groups, because in fact, this is not about violent organizations, because I cannot say anything about those organizations that do terrorism, but they're not able to mount up to civil war, sort of conventional activities. And how to distinguish conventional activities from terrorist activities. So the way I go for it is really keeping all the inclusion criteria of GTD and make sure that these attacks are sort of outside the humanitarian like they target non-combatants. They specifically target non-combatants, while the battle-related deaths do account for like civilians caught in crossfire, but they're not sort of the target of the attacks. So I think this allows me, to an extent, to actually overcome this sort of blurred line between terrorist tactics and conventional tactics and terrorist-related deaths and sort of battle-related deaths.
Okay, so I think I'm up on the 2, Joe. Is that okay? So I want to attack this. David's comments again. Props, because he dove into an issue much more deeply than I had been able to think about it reading the paper. So I want to suggest two avenues, one much more conceptual and the other a combination of conceptual and empirical, that I think you can pursue to strengthen and address this. On the conceptual, I make a different assumption than you do tactically, but just know that it's available to you. So I assume there is a budget constraint, and that there's, between any 2 items on the budget, I mean, if there are 3, like in my case, then it's not a 1-to-1 trade-off over any pair, but the whole thing does have to, sum to 1, right? And then moving to the empirical side, and so, well, even staying on the conceptual side, you can just clarify that you're not thinking of this as bounded. Okay, it's a proportion, and I didn't appreciate that. Because I tend to think automatically the other way. I was thinking of it as constrained, so if you just state that clearly, right? You're not bounded between 0 and these 2 things do not sum, sum to the full set of resources. And then that raises a question, and unfortunately I'm out of my depth methodologically. I wasn't familiar with the use of the logit model that, and haven't had a chance to read it. So my comment may or may not be helpful, but I'm familiar with a different use of rather than the logit link, it's the beta link, and my belief is that and I could easily be wrong, but my belief is that the logit is better for bounded, and that the beta is better for unbounded, and so there might be a reason to use that other model. It would actually tie more clearly to what you're thinking about conceptually. So hope those are helpful to think about.
Yeah, thank you.
Victor, you want to jump in?
Sure. So a couple of things. This is kind of a 2-finger leading into a little bit of a 1-finger. I had not, just a note from before, I would put the table of probabilities in the actual paper, okay? And my colleagues, if they think that's a bad idea, just go ahead and tell her it's a bad idea. But at least for me, I like papers where I can see it. It's not just in the text. It's all in one place, and I can really compare variables to variables. I like your portfolio approach. I think the issue here is not the way you're using it. So for example, to Erin's question about what about all this stuff that's not identified, just say we can't put the identified stuff in, right? I think the issue here is sales. I think it's the issue of selling this issue of, do we lean more this way, do we lean more that way? And to note that you're doing this yearly, and the variables, the independent variables, are changing yearly, and so are they having that effect on how they're spreading their portfolio, and really focusing in on the portfolio as your key not explanatory, as your key question of interest in a really powerful way. Maybe even changing it to the question of, the portfolio of killing, right? And you can have a portfolio of killing that goes this way, portfolio of killing that goes that way. I'm not sure if this fits erudition, but you might want to look at the Marab piece on violence, nonviolence, and a combination, because it has a framing of a similar kind of analysis and might be useful for you to take a look at. For the GTD, it just occurred to me, when you do the GTD, are you taking out the military personnel attacks?
Yeah.
Okay, so make that clearer. Okay, make it clear that you're really focusing on civilians versus military attacks. One thing you might want to think about is taking the military personnel attacks and combining them with the UCDP data, right? Because then you're really killing security versus killing civilians. That's what I'm doing in one of the analyses, one of the papers that I mentioned before. I think one of the real key things that's missing here, and it occurred to me as we did this, is I think you're missing, and this gets back to that portfolio question, I think a mini case study to start. Pick an interesting group where you can show a table that shows the killing, this kind of killing goes up, this kind of killing goes down, up, down, right? Okay, and you can say, why is group, why are the Joseph Young terrorist organizations, why are they changing in these 5 years? They're 80% of the stuff they're doing is killing soldiers, 20% is civilians. But in these next 5 years, the JYT is focusing more on civilians and much less on soldiers. Why does it change? And you can talk about that specific group, and you can talk about, ideally, you can tie it into the variables of interest you're talking about. I think that's going to make it a much more powerful sales approach and actually make it much more theoretically interesting, as well as help you tie in the theoretical stuff that you're touching on now, but not really diving deep into.
Okay. Thanks.
Erin, you ready to jump in?
Sorry, it took me a second with a new mouse that has to be charged with the little USB thing. It takes me forever to get recharged. Sorry about that. So this is just one comment sort of building off of the discussion about why rebel groups, and it's mentioned a little bit in the paper on, I think, page 9 of the PDF. This might be expanding too far, but it seems like you have a paragraph or so that's sort of talking a little bit about what it is that rebel groups need from civilians and why they might be disinclined to attack them. But I didn't feel like that was addressed as much or as fully if you were talking about sort of this hearts and minds option as an alternative to killing civilians. I'm not sure if that's going beyond the scope of the paper, if it's something that was mentioned in here in more detail that I seem to have picked up on, but something that might also help explain perhaps why the use of rebel groups versus other violent organizations.
Margherita, did you want to reply to that?
No, I'm still thinking about it.
Okay, I'll two-finger real quick on this general point. And again, it's sort of a framing issue. I like the idea of sort of starting off with some conflicting evidence and showing some groups' behaviors, et cetera. I think, again, the other real cool part of the portfolio argument you're making is, I think the early stuff that was done on the overlap of these kinds of political violence, like Sam Banis's 2008 paper was really just about, are the same factors that cause terrorism the same factors that cause civil war violence? Mike Finley and I's paper on sort of, are these co-occurring? We were just sort of looking at whether these incidents are happening at the same time. You're building on that and taking it to an interesting place, I think, for a lot of us who are interested in these kind of trade-offs. I think I would bring that in too and just say this is a natural extension, is sort of building on what these folks did, and it's a little bit better way. And that can also, again, going back to the point that Victor made about kind of addressing the puzzle, these other arguments can't really deal with this puzzle, but in the way it's been done. But the way I'm doing it, it can.
Right. No. So yeah, I think I really like these comments on how to frame it, and sort of, because I at the moment have 3 different literatures that I'm sort of bringing in the paper, and they're all spread over, and I'm not sure how to sort of which one I really want to enter in dialogue with and how to deal with the other 2. So I think I really like this idea of taking a case and sort of showing over time what's happening with the 2 tactics, and then go back to sort of this evolution. So go back to the literature of terrorism in civil war and build on that. But then I'm not sure the way I have to use the other 2 literatures. That is the one on territorial control and sort of choice of tactics, and external support and choice of tactics. So if you have any suggestion about this, would be really helpful. Maybe I just need to take them out and use them to theorize, or yeah.
David, you have ideas?
Well, I don't know how specific the ideas are, but as I was reading the sort of lit review and theory, I will say that it was sometimes hard for me to tell which was which, and which was your sort of argument that you make reference to when existing literature supports a step in your argument, and what is a sort of survey of what has already been done. So I think to a degree, it's making the argument more forcefully than in reference to the literature, because I think it reads sort of overly deferential to existing literature now. And so I think the suggestion leading off with the case is a really good one. And then leading into your argument about that case, drawing on, referencing the literature, but in a more concise fashion when it's there, and then making it very clear what the contribution is to that existing literature will make that the front end of the paper much clearer, much stronger.
Thank you.
Okay, so and it actually dovetails a little bit now, and I'll present it as the one. And so one of the things that I had jotted down is I asked myself, well, because you say I'm using the bargaining framework, and I was thinking, do all 3 of these primary incentives, these 3 things that change that impact their incentives to use the tactics, are they all tied to the bargaining framework? And I'm not willing to say no, they are not, but it became hard for me to figure out why they were, and I went, wait a minute, I'm the reader, not the author. The author's supposed to do that. Margherita is the, so, and I think that's consistent with what David's saying, and I liked his characterization I would agree that, I actually don't like separate literature review sections. It's a personal, it's a taste thing. Some people like it and some people don't. You do what you want to do. But so blending, what I like to see is a stronger version of your voice, like David was suggesting. That this is my argument, where you're pointing out who am I building on as I make that, and who am I arguing with as I make my argument, right? And then the literature just gets naturally referenced. And so I think a different way that pulls together all 3, and again, I'm imposing my own thinking on this, and that may not work for you at all. But if you do think of this is a tactical choice and there's a trade-off, Joe called it a basket, that all 3 of these are quite naturally involved, right? And the bargaining can play a role or not. I'm not sure how relevant that was, and you need to play with that and think about it. Oh, and I was tying it to one other thing, and now I've lost it. Now, hopefully I'll think of it in a second and come back to it. I apologize.
Can I, in the meantime, have like a clarification question? When you say all the three of these, you mean sort of terrorist violence, conventional military action, and non-violent? No, I didn't understand.
Sorry. Let's see. What page of the PDF is this? This appears. Oh, come on. Tell me. All right. I don't know how to read my own little PDF reader. But you know, I expect I'm reading from the. It's the right above the advantages and disadvantages of terrorism over conventional war, and I expect that rebel groups with high control over territory. That's one thing. Second, rebel groups who receive military support by external, right? And then those three, I'm reluctant to use the word mechanisms because it's so horribly overused. Those three factors, characteristics, processes, mechanisms, I don't know. Whatever you want to label those are the three I'm talking about. And all three of those things, as I understand your argument, change. You know, as those three things move, your incentive to trade off terror tactics for military tactics changes. Right? And you don't currently have a common story about why that's the case, but I think part of it's because you haven't thought of it as a basket. So when you said, should I drop two of them? I don't know. We can play back the video. I think my eyes went, no. That doesn't mean you shouldn't, but my initial reaction was, mm-mm.
So my common story on this is about the function of terrorism and the tactical advantages of terrorism. And the common story is in one of these three, when one of these three factors pops up or variates, those tactical advantages variates too. And that's why that's the common story, but maybe I need to make it.
Well, and the one time you say, at least that I remember, the one time you say anything about the framework that you use, you mentioned bargaining.
Right.
And I couldn't connect bargaining to that point.
I see. No. So what I said is that generally, these like the theories that look at this mixture between terrorism and conventional armed violence speak about the bargaining, right? But so one costs more than the other one, and therefore a group pick up one because it cannot afford the other one, right? And I speak about that just to say that at the moment we cannot actually know whether what the literature tests for is an actual strategic choice, because we cannot assume. So we observe, we have this outcome variable, that is the number of terrorist attacks or the number of terrorist-related deaths, but we don't know. So that therefore we cannot speak about, we cannot infer we know something about the actual bargaining that there exists over there in terms of tactical choice. Does that make sense?
I'll speak for myself and then let others respond. So I now understand your paper much better.
Right.
I did reading the paper. And as you'll see when you get a chance to read that draft I sent you, that I've got a whole vocabulary worked up for me to you and I are doing very similar things in that regard. We're interested in answering different questions, but the way we're thinking about it is quite the same. And I now see how bargaining, so you have and you actually do talk about the power to hurt. So you have a conventional power to hurt. I'm trying to impose costs on this person over here, but I also got to need to pay attention to production costs and expected value of the impact. I think you don't actually talk about, you do talk about production costs actually. But notice how the conceptualization I mean, this goes back to what David was saying. It's, you know, it's not clear yet. It goes back to what Victor was saying, you know.
Absolutely, it's not clear.
That makes sense. So the ideas are bouncing around in your head, but I don't know if this works for you, but one thing I stole from my advisor, Gur, is box and arrow diagrams.
What
Right?
is that? All right.
Box and arrow diagrams.
All right.
You can't, you know, draw your argument, you know, and you don't have to use those. Tilly also likes those. You know, there are a variety of different things.
If you're telling me you're not understanding whatever I'm writing, because to me it looks totally sensitive. Like, it makes perfect sense. And then, you know, it's good that I'm pushed to actually speak about my thoughts this way, so that I can understand what I didn't write clear enough. And that's a good suggestion. So yeah, so the idea is basically I speak about bargaining just to refer to the literature and just to say we cannot actually, well, we can theorize a lot, but not enough has been done yet to understand whether this is actually about a tactical choice between two tactics that has price and, you know, and tactical advantages. So that's the idea. And that's why I think the portfolio makes sense too, but probably the idea of portfolio of violence, but probably have to push that a bit more, make it clear.
A related point on this, when you're, I think every time you're bringing up a sort of contested concept, whether it's, and I just wrote down a list of them, but like terrorism, guerrilla warfare, legitimacy, state capacity, make sure that you're, you know, you're defining them right. You know, you can do it right away in a footnote or whatever, but don't leave the reader kind of wondering what is that thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Victor, did you have another direction you want to take us?
Well, so let me address something we've been talking about now, and then I'll take us in a different direction. I'm going to say something heretical. I don't think this has anything to do with bargaining. This isn't about bargaining. This is about deciding what tactics to use and how to distribute your resources. Who are they bargaining with, right? It's like Margherita, as a graduate student, you can put time into grading the papers you need to as a TA. You can put time into your research, or you can put time into watching the best TV show on TV. Now, your dissertation advisor is going to have an impact. The people you associate with are going to have an impact. And the person who's overseeing you as a TA might have an impact if they actually look at how you're grading. But you're not bargaining with anybody about this. You're deciding how to invest your resources. And I really think this is much more about how to invest your resources, how to establish your portfolio, than it is about bargaining. Now, I think it's fine to mention the bargaining literature because that's how other people have framed it. But I don't actually read your argument. I feel like your argument is being shoehorned into bargaining, and I don't think it's got anything to do with bargaining. I'd be curious to hear what other people think, but I don't think this has anything to do with bargaining. Okay? And a lot of people default to bargaining, but you're not negotiating with anybody on this. The terrorist organizations are making strategic decisions or tactical decisions about how to spread their portfolio. Let me address another point, which is I don't buy your argument about territory. Okay? You make an argument about territory that rebel groups with high control are likely to decrease terrorism over conventional warfare because terrorism may endanger their ability of concealment and organizational survival. Well, no. Organizations that control territory can't conceal themselves, right? When you control a piece of territory, the government or outside forces know where to bomb the hell out of you, okay? So I think you need to go in various directions in terms of thinking about why territory might be pushing for that decrease in terrorism. But it's not because, I don't think, I mean, unless you can pull out a lot more theoretical argument here, I don't really think it's about organizational survival or concealment. It's about something else, right? And I think actually territorial control links up. You don't link up directly. You link up with Weinstein with the other material, but you don't link Weinstein up so much with the territory. But I actually think Weinstein's argument about, well, you're controlling territory now, so maybe you don't want to treat the people in your territory like crap because you want to exploit them in a more productive way. I think that might be a much more useful theoretical way of thinking about it. Since I'm already on a roll, I'll keep talking, which is the other thing that the other literature that you might want to look at, and I'm not an expert in this literature, but whenever it comes to territory and these kind of insurgent organizations, in some way, these are organizations that are trying to become states, right? They're state building, and I think that argument has a possibility of also feeding into this. But I would say very strongly, I don't buy the concealment argument because territory is not it just doesn't align with what you're finding, actually, and it doesn't seem to make sense in terms of the IV that you're looking at. And I'll stop now.
Can so again, this is a very first draft, and I think I fluctuated in between this sort of a power to resist the state and also sort of the problem of rebel groups that wants to become state and sort of acting as proto-state and trying to actually sort of try to get some legitimacy and exercise power without force. So, and yeah, it's a great suggestion. Thank you.
David, you're up.
Okay, thanks. So I think this follows a bit on that, but it may take it in a slightly different direction. And that's, I really agree with Will and the way Will talked about sort of setting up the theory. I think you need to be very clear at the introduction of the theory what the assumptions are. And I think related to the sort of portfolio topic, this question of, I think also the way Victor talked about it with, you know, thinking about tactics and tactical choice, that's really very clearly how you have to frame it. I think also for me, it was, you know, when we think about tactical choice, you're focused primarily on the way that rebels are responding to, or they anticipate sort of civilians responding to them, or their need for civilian support, their need to kind of recruit from civilians. And that's one important consideration for rebels. But that's not the only consideration that rebel groups have, presumably, when thinking about tactical choices. And so I found in the theory, I was wondering what was going on with the state, right? I mean, you set up with bargaining, but if you're going to talk about bargaining, I sort of expected to think more about what the government was doing, the way the government was likely to respond to these different tactics and the role that would play. There's also, of course, the international community beyond just the supporters, but right, there's a lot of work on the way that rebel groups or other actors pick strategies or do things that they do based on anticipations of support from the international community. You can't do all of that in one paper, right? And I don't think you need to, but you do need to be, I think, more explicit about what exactly you're focused on and why that's appropriate. And then that'll help to guide the reader through the theoretical story that you're telling and not have those sorts of questions about why aren't we talking about X, Y, and Z? Because of course you can't talk about everything.
I think this word bargaining is like leading me very far from my theoretical idea, and so I think, and as Victor was saying, is about really tactical allocation, and so yeah, I'll change that.
Okay, so I know we've gone through a lot of theory and framing. Maybe we can talk methods and data if people have suggestions on that. And I'll just throw a couple down. One practical suggestion is we don't probably need to know a lot about how you constructed the data. We can, you know, just sort of assume you did it correctly and kind of move on from there. and kind of related to Will's point about the model you use, I think it's sensible, the model you use, but you might just try a bunch of different ways and hopefully it all comes out the same. And if it doesn't, then you try and make a more explicit theoretical argument about why this method is the most appropriate given your setup.
Yeah, will do. I like the suggestion about the beta link, and I think I'll try it tomorrow. I'm pretty confident things won't change much.
You want to jump in, David?
Well, it's just another comment on the empirics. I think this relates to having a clearer conceptual theoretical story throughout, but it wasn't clear to me exactly what the logic was for why you control for the control variables that you have. And I think that, again, relates to it not being as clear exactly what the sort of theoretical story is. So clearly you want to think about, if it is a story about the degree to which rebels have to rely on civilians, then you want to think about what are the other factors that might influence that, right? That then could be those omitted variables. And so there was, the control variable section is basically, here's a set of things, and there's a short justification for each one, but I think you need to set that up as, this is why I would control for anything, right? This is the logic by which I would control for things. And then these are the factors that feed into that I need to control for.
Yeah, I doubly agree. I think that's a good suggestion. And even, if your answer is kind of resolving this puzzle or this debate, then you operationalize that answer in certain ways, and those variables are the ones you use. And then there's alternative ways that we might think about it or explain it, and those are the things you operationalize as control variables. If, these other this factor may or may not matter, I don't think we necessarily need it in the model.
Okay. Yeah, the way my logic for the control variables so far has been trying to think about something that might influence both your dependent variable. But maybe I have to think in another term. So what is my theory saying, and what is the main, which variable can actually affect the main proxy I'm trying to capture with the independent and the dependent variable. So yeah, thank you for the suggestion. I'm learning a lot. Thanks.
So people have other points on data methods kind of issues. Yeah, Erin, you want to jump in?
Sure, this might be an overly minor point, but I was just a little bit, I felt like there was a little bit of a disconnect between how you were discussing the hypotheses and then the explanatory variables. I was just a little bit unclear why you used a binary variable for territorial control. Why not just explore if there's any difference if you use the 3 different tiers of that? And then additionally, looking at transnational financial support, is there any consideration for groups that receive? I think that I feel like the sentence said something like exclusively transnational financial support, and just if you had explored different sort of iterations of financial support transnationally, and within the territory, other sources of financial support, just seeing how different sort of ways of thinking about financial support, either internal to the group or external from the group, in different ways that can manifest, how that might have different implications or not at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thanks. So I can certainly try to shape the independent variable differently and see whether something changes. And I'm trying to think about whether I do have financial support from an internal group. I certainly have data on financial support from state actors, but I think this might be systematically biased. I'm going to look into the data and see what I can actually, or what is available out there that I might be able to use. Yeah, thanks.
Go ahead, Victor.
Okay, so a couple of things. The first is that if you have data on states' financial support and state military support, I would include them. Run a VIF and see if they're too correlated, but I don't think they're going to be. And I think that's very important because that'll give you, if you are finding the same results for state support and non-state support, that's going to be very interesting. And if you're finding that they're different, that's going to be interesting as well in terms of your larger theoretical argument. So if you have them, I would use them. I think that Erin's comments contradict Joe's comments. Joe said, which, Erin is very bad for you for all sorts of reasons. But Joe said that he wouldn't put a lot of emphasis on the writing up the what the variables are and what they mean and so forth. And I'm going to disagree with him. At the very least, for your sake, I would start by
Victor, that's a misinterpretation of what I said. I said
okay.
I was talking about construction of the variables, like I'm merging this data set with that data set. And
okay, then I misunderstood what you said. Yeah, so I would cut down on that component about how you put the data sets together and focus much more on the variables, what they mean, how they were coded, because how you merge this stuff, I mean, that's painful and horrible, and you can put that in the appendix, but I don't want to read about it. What I want to read about is what does financial support, what does military support actually mean? How much does it change? Okay, but I think the key underlying issue you have to deal with is what's your story? Okay, what's the story you're telling? Because your findings are interesting, but what you really need to get there is what's your story about why this is happening and what the impact is. And I would clear your mind of bargaining. I would clear your mind of other stuff. And I would just say, okay, why do I think this is going on? Then tie it to a particular organization so that you can implement your story and then build out the theory argument from what the story is that you think you're finding information to.
Erin, are you going to jump in?
Oh, sure. Am I unmuted? Yes. So just sort of going back to a little bit of what Victor just said and something that he said earlier about just footnoting that you can't include cases, or you can't include attacks where you don't know who the perpetrator is. It may be helpful just as a robustness check also to go and look at, in some of these cases, you might have a terrorist attack where no, it's not claimed by an actor, but if they're the only actor that's operating in that country in that year, you can say with a decent amount of certainty they're probably the one who perpetrated that attack, and just doing that perhaps throughout these throughout the observations as a robustness check, instead of just assuming that none of them were perpetrated by these actors and dropping them out of the analyses. It's something that perhaps might not change the results at all, but just I think it's important to do that both ways versus just list-wise deleting anything that's not claimed.
I think it's kind of so I had to do something very similar for my first paper when I sort of checked for the organization within mass movements. So organization sharing the same political goal with sort of mass dissident movements and like using terrorism instead. It's a pain, and I believe that it's like I would have to spend so much time actually coding and checking for the target, the audience of the attacks. And so I think there are two ways I can go for it. I think I could just say I cannot include this because I don't know where these attacks are from. And the other way I can go for it, it's actually checking by country how many missing name of perpetrators are there, and see whether there are like some sort of weird distribution that pops up, and see, and maybe think theoretically if there is an actual reason, systematic reason why this is the case. But I'm not gonna put myself into coding now. I'm just not gonna, not now. Maybe later on, maybe during my postdoc, but not now.
Okay, David, you jump in?
Okay, yes. So I had a couple of other comments on the analysis. So one is that and I can't remember if you talked about this in the paper or not, but it jumped out at me how it appears there's a lot of missing observations. So initially you say you have like 1,000 or 1,100 something conflict year or dyad years, and you only end up with about 574. That's a pretty big drop. And I wonder if you thought about like multiple imputation or doing something to examine the missingness, because it's, I mean, it's never random in any of this. And then another comment I had was, so on the external support data, I mean, Kristen and Nadine and I coded these variables, so, but I would actually use the UCDP external support data instead. When we started coding this, that didn't exist, and we weren't trying to code annual data. We were trying to pick up big changes, and so I think that we did that to the best of our ability, but they have annual data, and so I would at the very least run it with theirs alternatively and see. But given that that's two of your three main independent variables, and you're going to lose 3 years because I think their data ends in 2011, so that's the downside. But I think their data is better on external support in the period in which they code it. So I would use that.
So I did try that, but I have much less observation than available.
Why? I mean, I know it's those 3 years, but
yeah, but it's for every rebel group they mount up, and then what I'm doing is also I'm lagging, so by 1 year, and that's also why I don't have that many observation in the end. And then yeah, probably I'm pretty sure I tried a model without the lagging. That was long ago. It works. Maybe I can just include it in. But yeah, the reason why I have missing data is because of the lagging, missing. I think more or less randomly, more or less randomly in the dataset, and yeah, and the UCP external support. I mean, maybe I can include that, but I have a lot less observations in the end.
Victor, you want to jump in?
Yeah. So I didn't start talking about the data you were using because I figured one of the people who created the data was here. So and David, you just brought up a point that I wasn't.
Fine. I don't care.
No. You brought up a point that I wasn't sure about, but you affirmed what I was worried about. So if you're doing yearly analysis, okay, especially for your key independent variables, they absolutely need to be real yearly variables. Okay? They need to be. Otherwise, there are other ways you could do the analysis. But if you're doing yearly analysis, then your variables need to be truly yearly. And if they're not truly yearly, one of the reasons why you may not be finding in the yearly data what you're finding in this data, because the yearly data is really yearly and this data isn't. And so your non-findings may be more accurate. I don't know that for sure, but I think it's really, really crucial to make sure. And so, for example, when we were using the BAD1 data, which was just one observation for 8 years, we didn't do yearly analysis. We just did analysis for the time period. And certainly a lot of people have used the UCDP data in that way. That's the right way to use it. So again, this goes back to that point that I was making, that you really need to explain the variables, make sure that the variables, when you say they're yearly, you got to make sure they're yearly. Otherwise, you could get reviewers, or worse than reviewers, people who have read the article and say it's bogus. You don't want that. And so I think the territory variable may hold here, but if you can't find sufficient observations for a variable for yearly analysis, you either need to do non-yearly analysis, or you've got to take those variables out of the equation and use different variables, or just take those variables out of the equation. I'm assuming people are agreeing with me on this.
Oh, yeah, go. Do you want to jump in or reply first?
Me? Yeah. So yeah, I can try a cross section, and and I will try again.
Well, no, I would just try, before you try cross-section, I would go the route that David just suggested.
The UCD.
Right, and see if you can get enough variance there and if you can find similar results. And then your last resort would be cross-section, because you're not gonna, it's not gonna be as compelling as yearly stuff or incident stuff.
Thanks. Yeah.
Just a minor point on that issue, which is, I mean, one of the sticking points here is whether you're explaining between unit variation or within unit variation. And so I think I'm less concerned, although maybe a reviewer would be, if your data were all cross-sectional, if your argument were about comparing these different units, because there could be ways that you deal with endogeneity even in a cross-section. But if your argument is about, within and over time variation, then having that yearly data is important.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
David, you had something you want to say on that too?
Yeah, I agree with Victor. I think here would be, having coded quite a bit of this data, here would be my take. So on the territorial control, I don't think it changes that often.
Mm-hmm.
In that I don't think that a group goes from controlling territory to not controlling territory all that often. And I think that when that does happen, we probably pick it up, because we do code big changes. You use the high value of territorial control. So if a group controls territory at a high level and then it goes to medium, I'm not sure we pick that up. I'm not sure that shows up in the NSA data. And conceptually for you, it should, right? That should change the coding. So that would be my take on that. I actually don't think it changes that much, so I wouldn't be that worried about it. But the fact that if I'm right that it doesn't change that much, that's more of an argument for cross-section anyway, because actually you have a lot of data that doesn't change that much. I mean, if you start going through the controls, those things are generally pretty constant. And I didn't read your story the way it's set up here as being so much about changes within the group. I read it more as being a cross-sectional story. And in that case, I mean, I don't know. I think the annual data, I still think it's fine to have, I think I agree with Joe if I understood exactly what Joe was saying. I mean, I think it's fine to have annual data on the dependent variable side. I don't think you necessarily have to pool it for the whole time, right? Because I mean, we constantly have variables that don't change or that don't change much on the right-hand side, and we're using that to explain this sort of distinction. But I think it is more of an argument about the kind of groups that use more terrorism or less terrorism, and less about why one group shifts tactics over time. And then that, though, relates to the earlier discussion we were having about the framing and whether you want to start with one case and show this sort of variation over time, or whether you want to go into a little bit more depth about a couple of groups that look pretty similar, maybe in some other ways, but take substantially different tactics that then you can return to as showing that one of them controls territory and the other doesn't, or one of them receives military assistance and the other one receives financial assistance, right? And so I think that's more the story here.
I will have to double check the data properly and then sort of, I think I could go for a cross section, but I'm gonna try again with the UCDP and see how many variables I can, observation are there, and how can, no, but I have to check for this variation over time, absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm going to jump in and just make some other practical suggestions, and other people can feel free to do the same. A couple of just sort of practical matters is giving the variables in your, when you name a variable in your method section, just give it like a sensible name, like territorial control. You know what I mean? To like give it sort of all these sort of other, even what it's called in the database, but just so the reader knows exactly what it is, and I don't have to go back and go, oh, what's Turkin? I think as just a kind of practical suggestion, yeah, let's see, other people gave some, oh, and another practical suggestion is when you are stating your hypotheses, I would start like very, very simply, like here's the independent variable, here's the expected change that I expect to see on the dependent variable. Because the way the hypotheses read right now, there's a lot of other words in there that kind of make me go, I'm not sure exactly what I'm testing here. And so just start almost with like a mathematical equation, which is a letter, a change, and then another letter. And then you can add the words in, but that amount of simplicity will make the hypothesis, I think, more easily testable.
Okay.
Other folks have some practical advice, maybe about after revision. Yeah, go ahead, Erin.
There you go. So I think Victor might have alluded to this a little bit, but for the figures 1 through, I forget how many of them there are, I personally didn't find these to be terribly sort of compelling or easy to, they didn't do much of a story for me. So I don't know if there's a way to perhaps put this all on one figure so that you can see, I think Victor says variable by variable, or perhaps just put it in the appendix or get rid of them altogether. To me, like if a graphic's going to be in there, it should be doing something for the reader that the words don't do. And as it currently stands, at least from how I'm reading this, it's not adding much to the story. And I think I spent more time on each page figuring out what exactly they were trying to show than like, oh, this helps me to understand the findings.
Mm-hmm. I was just trying to sort of visualize myself the extent of the effect. And that's what I thought maybe it's useful to put in there. But I did report it, the extent of the effect in text too. Either or.
Yeah, I'd say either or just like if there's a way that you can graphically represent this all just in one figure, as opposed so that you can not just look at the extent of the effect, but really be able to compare, as opposed to having to scroll back and forth across multiple figures that are taking up a lot of space. But doing this all in one figure I think would be more sort of compelling and help to synthesize the findings for the reader.
Thanks for the suggestion.
Hi, Victor.
So I think basically, Margherita, what I think you have here is you've got a really good start. And I think if you find this, again, once you've made these tweaks in terms of the data and so forth, I think you've got that skeleton to build the story around. Once you have that story, I think something that would be really useful is to try and identify what journal you think you want to send this to first. And then go to that journal and try and find three or four most relevant articles to that journal. It wouldn't hurt to cite those articles, but it would also be useful before you start writing it up fully to read through those and see how they frame it. And that could also be very beneficial for thinking about how you might frame it. Let's say if you're sending it to ISQ versus if you're sending it to JCR, right? Plus you're citing pieces that are likely to be people who are reviewing it. And that never hurts.
Have you, and I guess this is a question, but have you thought about sort of where it would be good for you to place this, or where you would like this to go?
To be honest, not yet, because this is really the very first draft. I sort of finished writing it. I wrote the conclusions because I wanted to send it to this workshop. And then since then, I haven't worked on it. I had to work on many other things. So this is great because actually now I have a lot of feedback and a lot to think about and a lot to work on, and I feel like I can go in a good direction, but I didn't actually think. Do you have any suggestion?
So, I mean, I think it's a little, I like to think about these sort of things as like an Olympic dive. And I think there are some things in this project that are really difficult, which I think raises the likelihood it can hit somewhere solid, but it also has to be executed well, right? And so assuming you sort of execute a revised project that shows this much promise, I think it could do pretty well. You know, and it sort of depends on your own, you know, your needs and what you want. But I could definitely see ISQ kind of this being relevant to them, you know, less so than, because I think you're speaking across literatures, and so it's less a simple, now I don't want to say JCR, JPR is simple, but those are tough journals to get into, but those tend to have a little less cross appeal.
Okay, thank you.
Do other people have a feeling on that?
ISQ is never bad. I think part of this is going to really depend upon where your story goes. And for me, Joe, this reads like a really strong JCR piece. But, you know, I think it's going to depend upon what it looks like when you're done with the, when you figured out the story you want to tell. David,
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with Victor. I mean, on ISQ, I think it's plausible. I do think that it's not particularly international, which may or may not matter. I mean, it's sort of hard to tell. But I think JCR, JPR would be a great outlet for this, and so I think that's a good target again as it comes together after revision. And I would just say I think this is a really good first draft. So and you got a lot of good feedback for how to make it much better.
So thinking about tactical choices, I'm waiting for, so I have 3 papers submitted. If at least one of them get accepted, then I can think of sending this to, then I don't have time constraints, that's my point. But I don't know yet, so we'll see.
As an academic, you will always have time constraints.
But all right, fair enough. So I'm in my 3rd year of the PhD, and I'll finish next year in December. So that's my main time constraint now, and then I'll wait for the news soon, and then we'll see. But I think this is great. I mean, now I really have a lot of work to do and a lot of good suggestions, and I really want to understand which way this paper is going in the end.
Great, and I just want to reiterate, I think it's promising, and I think it's worthy of investing your time in.
Thank you.
So do other folks have another comment before we wrap up?
I would be happy to take another look at it once you've revised it.
I will send it to you, Victor. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Joe, thank you for taking the lead on being the chair, as Christian didn't show up and Will is not here, so thank you.
Oh, no. Thanks, everybody. I mean, this is like, and now Margherita too, but these are like my favorite people, so this is fun.
Okay, great.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Erin.
Thanks, everybody. That was
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.